So the outline for today is going to be, we're going to proceed in the following way. So I'm going to begin with a very broad discussion of what we mean by archives, and I have some pinpointed answers and reflections on what, where, why, who, when, and how, and then a brief discussion of some problems. And as my colleague Peter just mentioned, if there's any part that you want to ask a question about or you want to get more clarifications about, please feel free to raise your hand. Again, these are not meant to be structured as a lecture or a presentation, but they're more structured from real lived experience when it comes to doing archival work in and from the Middle East, in North America, and in places in Europe. After I'm done with that section, Peter is also going to add a few of his own reflections. We'll have a quick Q&A, and then we're going to dig deep into real world examples from our own work. So Peter is going to talk about his own work, then we'll have a Q&A. I'll talk about my own work, then we'll have a Q&A. And if we feel that we all are in need of a short break to grab a glass of water or do something, we might go for it. But if the momentum is strong and we're happy to continue, we can just push through and have a wider and detailed discussion of your research project. So let's begin with the obvious question and if you want, the $1,000,000 question for today. So just in the chat very quickly, if I just were to ask you what are archives, what would you say? If you were able to answer this in one sentence, what would you write? And please do that in the chat box. I love to collect your answers and we can talk more about them later on, but what do you think are archives? What are archives to you? We hear this word a lot in the Middle East, elsewhere, archive, right? We use it in Arabic as the word archive. So what do you think about what are archives? And I'm looking forward to seeing some responses in the chat window of what you would define as an archive. Collection of historical documents, records, okay. Historical records, okay. Other thoughts like magazines, newspaper clippings, YouTube videos. If I'm gathering YouTube videos right now, does that make an archive? Written, oral, visual recordings of events, oral histories. Great, that's something we can begin from. Wonderful. So when we're talking about archives, let's go with the basics. And really the basics focus on records and papers that are created by organizations and individuals in real time. And that real time aspect is very important. I'm going to be highlighting that several times because we're talking about the conduct of affairs happening in foresight, and we're looking at these documents in hindsight. What's important to keep in mind is that there are so many definitions of what we mean by archives, but for our purposes, and if we're going to think about it from a social science perspective, it's important to keep in mind that we're talking mostly about public, state-owned government records or private family records and institutional ones. What's important to keep in mind here is that when we are archivists ourselves, when we are preserving records, we don't know the actual value that is contained in this information until after the fact. So it's very important to keep in mind that value is such a subjective measure here, that we give value to these documents at a distance, and obviously after these events occur. So if one is gathering information right now, for instance, if you're observing what's going on between Palestine and Israel, or what's going on in Lebanon, or what's going on in Tunisia, or going on in Libya, it becomes very difficult to think that if you're just gathering small posters and clippings from here and there, are they going to have any intrinsic value 10 years from now? What's important to keep in mind is that many, and most archival records are unpublished materials that accumulate and grow over time. And this is something maybe we're doing already without even thinking about it, saving newspapers, family photos, posters, and flyers. From a research standpoint, we usually talk about archival resources as records and manuscripts. And we're talking about records. This could be anything related to documents, papers, blueprints, and other sources, government sources, business documents, or actual manuscripts where you can see undated, unpublished, large historical accounts, memoirs, or the personal records of individuals and influential families. And this could be your own archive, this could be your own lineage or your own drawing, basically a larger framework of documents that you want to talk about and that you want to engage with. So the second question that we want to focus on, where can we find archives? And the easiest answer is really at university libraries. Other places, government and states. These are personal photographs that I've taken from my visits, repeated visits to London, College Park, and DC, to different archival sources. We can think about international organizations. Many of them are digitized, so this is very important. We'll be talking more about that in a bit. We can talk about religious institutions. We can think about the Vatican. We can think about Al-Azhar. There are so many places to think about in terms of institutions, museums, This is a personal photo from the British Museum, very important. You'd be quite surprised that many museums host records and archival documents that may not be really interesting for particular projects, but once one gets access of finding aids, you become quite surprised how much information could be stored in places that are somewhat odd to be hosting, for instance, documents related to security or documents related to foreign policy decision-making. A very important source, whether it's during COVID or before COVID or after COVID, really has to do with personal collections. And there is a growing tendency that I want us to highlight and be able to talk about in a bit that has to do with the idea of digitizing many existing archival sources. This is one of the sources that I use a lot, and I would encourage anyone that wants to write about issues related to security, issues related to military coups or revolutions in the Middle East, at least between the 1942-43 period and the 1982-83 period, which we're talking here about 4 decades, to check these excellent resources, which are hosted by the Wilson Center and available to you, whether it's during COVID or not. And online sources have become the new way of thinking about digital archives, whether it's the National Security Archive, the Foreign Relations of the United States, and we can go more and more about examples when we get to the point where we're going to be covering more and discussing more your research projects. So some highlights, I'm not going to go over them, but why do we need archives, right? We answered the what are they, where can you find them, but why do we need them? And in reality, there are so many reasons. These are just some of the reflections that I've actually been able to figure out as I was doing my research. And these are takeaways that I constantly get reminded about when I'm doing archival research. So the most important part I would say is that we care about having a first-hand access to these accounts in hindsight. So I'm not really interested, for example, as researchers, we are interested in getting as close as possible to a certain event and how it occurred. So there's always this notion of, I don't want to read how others have reflected on that moment. I want to try to the extent possible to get close to that event. And this has to do with the fact of why we do research, whether it's to refine existing scholarship, to refute what we think are poor accounts, or really to provide novel accounts. And this is where we can talk more about theory testing or theory building. But the most important part that we want to keep in mind here is that there is an element of creating less biased accounts. And it's important because it does serve as a gateway to the past, and in many cases can help us fill in important gaps that could be left understudied or not fully accounted for because of several limitations, which we'll be talking about more in a bit. And just to give you an example, like how would it be different to think about a study of revolutions or uprisings in the Arab world if we don't really engage in field work and engage in archival research? How different would it be to write about the beginning of the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, the self-immolation of Abu Ali, and what that means, Abu Azizi, I mean, sorry, and what that means in reality for our purposes, to be able to look at oral history accounts, look at newspaper clippings that were being written and published in real time between December 2010 and February 2011. So if you just think about that for a moment as a very broad example, it becomes very difficult to be able to say, I'm just going to observe what's going on in Tunisia and not be able to have access to some oral accounts or first-hand accounts or eyewitness accounts. The question that I want to move on to right now is like, who can use archives? And this is obviously the answer is in brief, anyone. But for our purposes, I would say that some of what motivates me to think about why I should be using archives really has to do with the fact that I've always found missing answers in secondary accounts. I'm not saying all secondary accounts have missing answers, but there are topics that you need to have that proximity to the actual subject or unit of analysis that you're using to be able to make a better and more holistic overview of a certain issue. I'm very interested in decision-making processes, and I cannot but think about how to connect the dots between intelligence, between security services, between diplomats, when it comes to decisions of US foreign policy in the region. Another important element has to do with how institutions change, whether they evolve, whether they devolve over time. And the last thing that I want to mention is that I've met so many individuals at different archives, just being there, conducting research for personal reasons. And when I say personal reasons, trying to like draw their family tree, trying to forge some lineage when it comes to their family history. So what I'm trying to mention here and discuss here really has to do with the fact that the causal linkages that we're trying to build between the past and the present could really begin with research, but could also include other aspects as well. The golden question that I always debate with many scholars is, when can we use archives? And this is really something that I know Peter and I are going to be talking about it. And it's good that we might have different opinions, and we want to hear your opinions as well about it. So obviously there is no perfect way of when to use archives. Some would advocate for the idea of that at the beginning of the research process. So before, as you're writing your proposal, it's important to know, based on those before you and as you're writing up and preparing for your literature review, to know whether archival research is something that you have to do. So that's at the very beginning. In some cases, it happens in the middle of the process. As you're writing, you realize that some voices are missing. These voices could be related to important actors or other junctures that are missing. And in some cases, and this happens, it becomes an afterthought. You're done with the research, you're done with the writing, maybe your manuscript is almost done, your dissertation is almost done, and you realize that there are some missing leads that you want to pick up on. But the idea that you want to keep in mind is, well, the golden question is, what is missing or different in existing scholarship? So you're not beginning in vacuum. And I would encourage everyone, not only because we're still living the effects of COVID-19, but the fact of cutting time and knowing what to focus on when you're actually doing research in the field, is to keep in mind that you can begin from those before you. And that's something that I learned the hard way when I was thinking about my own topic, thinking, well, what's really available out there? And in some places, I ended up doing some short trips that were not that essential. So begin the journey and begin the hunting process by knowing, really making sure that you've covered and you've really explored everything before you when it comes to knowing whether these records are available or not. And sometimes I found buried down in endnotes or in footnotes, something like, these documents are burned, or these documents are no longer available, or these documents, I got this copy from that person, but that person, we don't know where the copies are right now. So even if I were to make a trip, and this happened when I was conducting research on the free officers in Jordan, and the actual person had the archive, it was one person that everyone was citing. When I went to Amman, I thought that I was going to be able to get access to it. So I spent a couple of weeks there, and then I realized that if I had done my research more closely, I did realize that that archive, particular archive, is with one person that's in New York. And that could have saved me the trip from Boston to New York, then going from Boston to Amman at that point in time. Some differences that Peter and I were talking about earlier on when we were talking about political science and historians, what's important for our perspective is that we like archival research. And when I say we, I mean political scientists, because we're trying to flesh out, trying to test, trying to debunk, or trying to build new theories that are based on important political occurrences or events that are occurring. And we care about finding the smoking gun argument to be able to confirm or refute certain hypotheses. And there is a very fine line between what we do and how historians approach it. And I agree with Peter in what he mentioned earlier on, is that in many cases, historians are looking at the value of the records, why they're stored in a particular way, and why they're trying to provide the understanding of certain events. They're not really interested, like we do in political science, to fill in certain gaps as much as most historians would care to provide a more holistic account of moments in the past. And this is where interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity is key, because it helps us really try to think whether these silos do actually matter, do they actually mean anything, or whether we should be sticking to the idea that we should be very subjective or selective about our archival resources and what we can do with the data. And that's something we can talk more about in the Q&A later on. So how can we use archives? And again, these are based on experience that I've done. And this is something that could be revised and rewritten, and I'll be happy to talk more about practical examples. And I know Peter is going to do that as well. So begin with consulting by bibliographies, try to contact experts in the field. This is the number one advice that I got when I was graduate school. Don't be afraid to contact names that you find in the field that have done this research before you. They might be willing, in many cases, to share, and that might really help you saving time and saving some of the trips that you don't have to do. The most important part is just make sure before you do any trip, as terms of an early preparation kind of method, is to ensure whether these records that you're looking for are digitized, which is going to save you tremendous time, or are they still in physical format. And your librarian at your university is supposedly one of your best friends when it comes to inquiring about existing networks and arrangements. I had a lot of help in America from different organizations that had these networks, and they were able to exchange documents, exchange microfilms that were extremely essential and useful, which saved me a lot of trips. So I would encourage you all to build this relationship, if you can, with your own library before you go out into the field. When you're going to begin the research, hopefully, and I say this hopefully because this is also varies across the board, finding aids are something that we love, and we find them in most Western archival locations. I wouldn't say the same thing about most archives in the Middle East, to be quite honest. It's been very difficult, and this is something that varies across the board. So you can find finding aids in Lebanon, for example. You can find some in Jordan. You can find some in Turkey, but that doesn't mean it's consistent across the board, or it's really updated, or it's really cataloged in a way that would allow you to save time and know that on my first trip, I'm going to do box 1 to box 14. On my second trip, I'm going to do box 15 to box 70. In most cases, these are constantly being changed in many archives around the Middle East and North Africa, but that's something we can talk more about. And again, if you want to build a circle of best friends, another best friend would be the person that you met there, an archivist in one of these sources, because they happen to be the gatekeepers of knowledge. And when I say gatekeeper of knowledge, they can make your life easy, right? By telling you, for instance, you can come at 8 a.m. in the morning and it's fine if you leave at 4 p.m. Or they're going to tell you, I'm going to go for a lunch break that's going to take me over 3 hours and a half. And I actually have examples from both cases, and that could derail you a lot. And I'm not talking about this, whether this is only something that happens in North America or something that happens in the Middle East. But given our focus on the Middle East, this is a part that you need to keep in mind, the hidden side of archival research, which is how to cozy up to these individuals. Funding your trips, getting money, that's going to be very important. How can you go do that? And obviously, these are just recommendations that you can think of. I've used all of them and they've worked so far. A smartphone, Google Drive, iCloud for space, software for digitizing documents. This is really going to help you later on if you're able to get this kind of software. Google Drive does that for free. Just as a tip to everyone, you can throw images on a Google Drive and it does OCR on them. So you can use your text, but you cannot download them. So that's a small trade-off. Plan your trip realistically. Like I get emails from colleagues in the US when they want to visit Lebanon, like we're coming over Christmas vacation, and it's often 2 or 3 people are going to be anywhere around Beirut during Christmas vacation. So that's, for example, one of those small caveats that you need to keep in mind. And make sure that you are following the different rules and regulations. I asked a few questions in Amman about Black September, right, that were not really taken in such a good way, right? And these were just broad questions about what's available in terms of documents. And so it's always good to have some kind of guide ahead of time to be able to know what are some of the rules and regulations beyond ones that are posted at the actual archive, right? And this is something that we can talk more about. And I hope you have questions about this in the Q&A, because Peter and I, from our positionality, we approach different and similar archives from different standpoints, right? So it's great to talk about our experiences. Peter might have had more access to things in Lebanon than I might have had in Lebanon, right? And this has to do with the fact that I'm Lebanese. What does that mean? Do I belong to a certain group or not? Which is not the same case for other scholars. And that's something that we can talk about in a bit if you want. Planning, executing your trip. So I would always go for the rule of 3, which is idealistic, realistic, and actual. So I always have this plan. I'm going to go create the entire archive, right? I'm going to go, and this happened literally in 2016. I went to the CIA Crest Archives in Maryland. It's a very small room, 4 computers. Most of the time, the printers are not working. You have to look for someone to get you toner, and that's at 1 p.m. So if you're there at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., you have to wait for hours for someone to get you ink. And then CIA decides to dump all the records online in 2017, just to give you an example. So the labor that I did for 4 months ended up with 1 click being all posted online. So my idealistic version going there was that I'm going to recreate that entire archive and print them out and bring 2 bags of actual paper, because you can't use the USB, you can't use the camera, you can only print in the actual FOIA electronic reading room at Maryland. So imagine that for a moment, 4 computers, more than 8 people working there, so we're taking turns. And then I realized, well, basically this wasn't a realistic plan or an actual plan. The actual plan was 25 kilos of paper, which is not really nice to drag around from Maryland to Boston. And then a couple of months later, these records were online. So there are mixed opinions about recreating files as is, going to the archive and being a machine about it, opening up every single file and taking every single photograph and uploading it, or being very selective and basically making good time of how you analyze. as a graduate student versus a faculty member versus a postdoc versus a graduate student, these are different considerations, right? But the idea comes down to how you would think this is going to be better for you. Are you going to read 10,000 pages later? And I'll tell you a small note bene, and Peter and I were laughing about this the other day. I have enough records for my book manuscript that I haven't been able to look at. So I have more than enough from all these trips, and I still need, I'll finish my book, I'll publish my book, and I still have records that I have not read closely. So sometimes we underestimate the power of how much is out there, right? When it comes to photographs, when it comes to organization. So keep that in mind. And the golden rule is really to back up your work as fast as you can. After your trip, and I'm going to start to sum up right now, after your trip, just keep in mind that an email to thank an archivist goes a long way. It goes really a long way thanking someone, right? Just saying thank you for, maybe they did one small thing, which is provide you with a pencil, because you're not allowed to take in a pencil. Maybe they provided you with a folder that you needed, right? But the idea is that there have been often cases where one person was able to go in and say, well, oh, those documents were misplaced, and here they are, right? So that person is really someone that I want to keep on my list, right? A check-in list, a touch base list. So keep that in mind. And this might sound like a cliche, but please do a scan of all your documents, store them with a cousin or friend. And I also have like a hard disk, a backup, and I use the cloud, because sometimes these archives might get shut. Something might happen where there might be a moment of crisis and you cannot no longer access them. So start as soon as possible to guard against that. I'm not going to cover the analysis and writing part because I know there was a MENA workshop on text analysis, but depending on your topic, it's going to be very important. And I know, Andrew, later on, you're going to get a link to all of this. So I'm not going to go into this, but the idea of turning text into data using SPSS, Data R, or free software to draw connections and relationships between words, frequencies, networks, mapping are all important ways of thinking about archives. And I'm happy to talk more about what I've done in my own work and what I'm doing right now on this issue. So problems, time consuming, obviously, what to pick on. Are we going to be motivated? Is there a motivated bias in a way? We're choosing what we want out of a huge treasure trove of documents. Are we all limited when it comes to processing thousands of pages? Do we have resources to afford to spend a semester in an archive or a month in an archive? Getting lost in the details, and what do you do with missing or redacted information? And in my case, because I work on intelligence and foreign policy, I often see many documents like this. This is a joke from Twitter, right? But these are two actual documents. And in many cases, I get this smoking gun document, just 25 pages online as a finding aid. I click on it. There's like one word that says Lebanon, right? Or Jordan. And then, okay, then there's like 25 pages and page denied. And we can talk more about that and how to circumvent it and what to do with oral histories and other strategies. But for people writing about security, and some of you are, or thinking about these foreign policy questions when it comes to diplomacy, you're always going to encounter missing documents, and you just live with it, right? You do a FOIA request, maybe your first book, second book, third book is done. The FOIA request is nowhere to be found, but at least there is the possibility of doing something like that. Some problems when it comes to the MENA, the definition of an archival document, as we began in the session earlier on, is really all over across the board. Is it oral history? Is it personal statements, speeches? Are these stolen records, classified information? It's very hard to find one definition of what an archival document is, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa. Governments are still in control. Mostly, I'm not going to go into types of governance in terms of saying, is it better to be in democracy or an authoritarian regime? You know the obvious answer, but the idea is that states are gatekeepers as well when it comes to providing access to certain documents. And in many cases, these documents really have to do with the fact maybe they're not there, maybe they were stored poorly, or maybe these documents should not see the light of day. And I'll give you a small example. After the August explosion in Lebanon, the August 4 explosion in Lebanon, a very big chunk of what is considered to be Lebanon's national archives was demolished at the port of Beirut, right? We don't talk about it, but in reality, that's a very big chunk of whatever archival sources we had that right now has been destroyed. And many documents, you'll be quite surprised, in many parts of the Middle East, at least where I've done work in the Levant, have really become personal records, not state government records. So they're actual state records. They're like military reports, or they're anything that has to do with diplomatic reports, but they have become personal records due to changes in governance, moments of occupation, actual civil wars. And in Lebanon, after doing a lot of work in Lebanon, it becomes very clear that many of these important political party archives are owned by one person. It's one individual that actually has them in their summer house or somewhere, and your access to what is an archive becomes that personal relationship with that individual. COVID-19 and other moments of crisis, inability to travel, obviously we discussed that. The temporary closure of institutions, what can we do? I'll give you an example of Lebanon. That was even before COVID. Several colleagues were in Lebanon in September and planning to stay till November to do research. Then we had the beginning of the October uprising. So that led to roadblocks, universities shutting down, archives not being accessible, no public servants working anymore or any civil servants. So that actually delayed their entire work for a couple of months. Documents can be removed, or there might be lack of access because over email, maybe sometimes individuals that you're chatting with can be very friendly, but in person, they might feel that there's something about you that doesn't click. So they can decide that they don't want to share these documents. And I've had that happen to me twice. And on those both occasions, it wasn't really clear that you're writing about security. You told us you're writing more about foreign policy. And I said, well, they're intertwined to a certain extent, and they didn't like that notion. And the notion of security services in the MENA sounds different than security services in somewhere in College Park or somewhere in Q. So important takeaways, like I just want to be clear about one important thing from the very beginning, and we can talk more about this, is that in reality, we have an abundance of records before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And if there's one thing that we learned about this sort of work during COVID-19 is that there's so much out there to process that it will take us decades to be able to do it. So the argument that we always have to be physically in a location is important, but that should not dissuade you from beginning somewhere, really looking at what's available out there in reality. And I love the approaches that actually materialize on Twitter and elsewhere between scholars creating digital platforms. And I invite you all to check out these digital archives. Some of them are under hashtag academic Twitter, some of them are under hashtag archives. But the idea is that many scholars decided to pull in their resources together and share documents because they can't make these actual trips. Establish contact, push yourself to talk with individuals that have actually done the work before you. In many cases, they're going to be more than friendly, and they can really make your life much easier than you can imagine. Keep a good relationship with gatekeepers. Archives are really fun. They're really useful. There's always going to be problems with funding and time to sift through all the pages and issues of redaction. But if your goal is to provide something new, refine existing scholarship, it's going to be important to think at least whether your work in any shape or form could benefit from such archival research. Skills, whether you're using archives or not for research and writing when it comes to organization, is going to be very important. And my important sort of takeaway is that once I'm feeling that I'm getting too close to my subject, I like to go back to the archives to be able to refine my own motivated bias, because there is an element of subjectivity, why I'm choosing certain records, certain documents, and certain locations.